Hello and welcome to the Deep Track Podcast, an exploration of watches, trends, and culture with a few adventures along the way. I'm your host, Blake Bettner. I'm really excited about the episode that we have for you today. We're going to be diving into a topic that I've been curious about for a long time and into for a long time, and it is mechanical keyboards. So I've got a guest on today who is also based in the New York area. His name is Diego of Lightning Keyboards. We're going to go through some of our history in this space, what drew us into this space, what makes these things so interesting to us, and advocate a little bit for maybe why you should be into this space or at least paying attention to it a little bit as well. He's also kind of a watch guy, maybe not really, but he wears some nice watch and he's got some pretty cool watches. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. There's going to be a lot of show notes for this one, and I will warn you at the onset, there might be some terminology and language at use here that might feel a little foreign to you, but I'll do my best to leave thorough show notes down below. So there are also great community resources from keycap. Again, I'll leave links to this stuff down below to Reddit, to some Discords that are all great for this. And it sounds like this is maybe a great time to be getting into this hobby. If you don't see yourself getting into it, I think it's still something that's interesting and, again, worth paying attention to. So without further ado, let's jump into our discussion about mechanical keyboards with Diego of Lightning Keyboards. All right, Diego of Lightning Keyboards, thanks so much for joining me on the Deep Track Podcast today.
Hey there, Blake. Thank you so much for having me.
So for anybody who's not familiar with you or with Lightning Keyboard, maybe give us a little introduction about who you are, what you do, and what you're all about.
Sure. So my name is Diego. I also go by Lightning or Lightning Keyboards in the community. And I'm based in New York City. I've actually been in this custom mechanical keyboard scene for about now 8 years. 7-8 years, and I pretty much what I do is I live stream custom mechanical keyboard builds, as well as feature new projects and designs that happen in the community via Twitch. I post those videos on YouTube, and I also maintain like an Instagram and a website. And yeah, I'm pretty much an active collector of keycaps, keyboards, and all kinds of keyboard related stuff overall. But I started as an enthusiast, and currently I just do this gig as a streamer and as a custom mechanical keyboard builder for people out there.
Oh, that's very cool. And I know that you and I kind of came into this hobby, this space, around the same time, around 7 or 8 years ago. And of course, it's a space that's changed quite a bit in that time, a bit like the watch space has in that same period of time. Before we get into that and get too deeply into it, we usually start these things off with a wrist check. I believe you are maybe a little bit of a watch guy. Diego, what are you wearing on your wrist today?
Well, I'm not huge into watches, but I do wear a watch on a daily since I was a kid. I'm currently wearing a Tissot PRX. I received this as a gift from a family member, and occasionally I wear some other watches. Like I have like a Seiko Cocktail Time. I have like just a generic Timex Weekender, a Citizen Weekender. But yeah, I just cycle through simple watches, but I'm not really into anything too deep.
Well,
on that
those are the watches that you just listed off are pretty much like all-time classics. So I think you could walk into any room full of watch nerds and get some respect, get some respect for those.
That's good.
I am wearing a Rolex Explorer 2, reference 16570 with a polar dial. It's kind of that time of year I like to wear watches like this, get things back on a bracelet. It's a pretty comfortable watch that slips under a big puffy coat. It hasn't been too cold here in New York, though. I was just out for a walk earlier. It's it's maybe like a single layer or something like that around here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds about right. It's pretty much been above freezing for the past few weeks, so it's been a pretty warm winter. I mean, as it has been the past few years.
Yeah. I could go for a touch of snow. I wouldn't mind actually. So, well, it's cool to hear that that you've been wearing a watch since you were a kid, and you've always got one on, kind of on the daily, and a couple of bangers there too at that. So let's switch gears here and get into the keyboard stuff a little bit. We, as I mentioned, we kind of entered the space around the same time. Do you remember what it was or where you first kind of encountered a mechanical keyboard and what it was about it that kind of pulled you into it, that made you kind of initially curious about this space?
Yeah, I guess my first initial exposure to it, aside from kind of like just products being out there, was when I was actually still in school. This was a long time ago, over 10 years ago. And that was, I just had a friend who was really into sort of like retro computing, kind of like vintage, like restorations for like old machines, like from typewriters to actual computers. And so he kind of just introduced me to the idea of it. I did have like a mechanical keyboard back then, like this full size, like MX Brown having cooler master board that I just had gotten as a gift from my brother, because he wasn't using it, and I was enjoying that already, and so I didn't really get interested back then. It was actually in 2016 when I was working down in the Washington D.C. area. A friend of mine, or rather, someone I got introduced to through work, he introduced me to keyboards because he just asked me one time. He was like, "Hey, it's the weekend, and there's this keyboard meetup happening at I think it was Georgetown University at the time, and apparently this was the first meetup, like in person meetup for keyboard nerds, keyboard enthusiasts in that area. And so he just invited me, and I said, sure, why not? Let's check it out. It sounds kind of cool. I kind of have been familiar with the idea of it, but I don't know anything about what this whole custom scene is about. And so, yeah, we went,
Mhm.
and it was just very different. I think the amount of customization, the appeal of all that, that's what kind of blew me away. That's what really got me into it
Yeah.
when I was first starting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's one of those things that you don't really put much thought into, and once you start kind of peeling just a few of the layers back, you realize how deep this world goes. And I think it's kind of initially shocking, just how deep the space can be, and at what level people have gotten into it. And I distinctly remember, when I had first gotten into it, I think it was a set of keycaps that I had seen somewhere on somebody's Instagram or something, like when the Miami colorway, I think, was kind of becoming a big thing, and being so curious about that, like, what is this, what's going on here, and then digging around on Reddit, which I think was a much smaller community back then, and discovering places like Geekhack, which were still like very
Yeah.
intimidating to me at the time, but it was like this gulf opened up underneath me as soon as I discovered it, and I was just fascinated by everything there. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, back then the community was definitely much smaller, and the web pages, like the websites, were kind of just very niche and just full of terminology and things that no one would be familiar with.
mhm,
And so I think the first thing that definitely draws you in, at least back then, was the pictures and just kind of seeing all these colors out there, because, usually keyboards are associated with just kind of a standard gray or black, black, white kind of colorways, and things that are just very standard, very neutral, very mundane. And then you have like kind of like the gamer appealing keyboards, which have all this lighting and RGB and all that stuff.
mhm,
But I think the custom scene has just evolved so much, and now we have all these keycap options, and all these keyboard options as well. We can go deeper into that when it comes to all these options. But
yeah,
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 I think the first thing that I noticed when I entered was just seeing that there was pretty much anything that you could do with respect to the size of the board, as well as the keycap options,
yeah.
and all these little things that you can actually change up about.
Yeah, and I think that's what kind of initially pulled me in further, after my initial curiosity was kind of coming to realize that this is something that is in front of me every single day, and I write a lot, so it's something that I use a lot, and I figured, this is something that I have so much interaction with, and maybe it should get more thought and attention, to kind of bring a different like quality of life feature, and kind of explore, my own creativity. But I do remember when I got into it, you know, like buying just kind of a pre-built whatever keyboard. Like I think a Ducky was the first like one that I bought at like a Micro Center or something like that, and put different keycaps on it, and feeling like, oh, this is really something cool here, and then learning that people got to the level of like where they were like learning how to solder, and like getting solder kits and stations in their home, and starting from the circuit board, or even without a circuit board, and putting all this together and then programming it all. And I remember thinking, oh, I'll never get to that level. And of course, it only took like a year or two before I like had my own soldering iron and was struggling to learn how to how to program one of these things, which I never really figured out all that well. I was kind of just stumbled my way through it. But like, were you surprised at how deep that some people went in this? And did you have any hesitation about going that deep into it at first?
Yeah, I think as far as the technicalities come, I wasn't nearly as surprised as some people might have been at the time, or kind of like yourself. I think most of that might be because I do come from like an engineering background, and I was already into this idea of wanting to do more DIY kind of projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I saw that people were just kind of bringing it upon themselves to do whatever need they had to kind of improve their everyday item, which in this case is the keyboard, I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, you want to optimize to better that device that you're using every single day of your life, especially if you're working in front of a computer. And so for me, it kind of came about naturally. I just thought, well, that makes sense that I should be exploring circuits, looking into the electronics of these devices, and if you look at PCs and if you look at gaming devices, they kind of got into that first as well. And so I think as a branch from that, it made sense to me that that existed. However, it was still a bit of a shocking discovery for me to see it much later in time. I think, way past the time when I was still like in college and university. And yeah, I think now at that point that I had the ability to sort of delve into these kinds of hobbies, I got really really interested in. So
Mm.
yeah, I just went right in for like a soldering kit, and I thought, hey, I think I'm going to enjoy this because this is more hands on. This is something that I can just do on my free time. It's kind of relaxing to do something new and to do it myself, to actually make something myself from scratch in a way.
Yeah.
Although there are like built kits.
Yeah, yeah. These days it's a bit different. I think people have far more options and avenues to get into this hobby than they did in the early days, which is a good thing. I think. Uh, did you? There is something therapeutic about this, by the way. You kind of mentioned that it's relaxing, and I mean, I would usually like look forward to a weekend when I always knew I was going to be, opening up 100 switches and replacing the spring or putting
Oh boy.
lubrication on them and doing all that kind of stuff, and then going through the soldering process, all that kind of thing. There is something very enthusiastic about it. Um, did you ever imagine that it would be something that is now like a big part of your livelihood?
No, not at all. I really thought it would be a very temporary thing. I thought maybe one or two kind of thing. Yeah, just like every small thing grows,
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
I only thought, well, I'm just going to do something that improves my life at that point. Replace something that I have with something that I made, and I'm going to be kind of done with it. But I think just the sheer amount of options that were coming into that market at the time was really interesting, and so I kind of kept at it. I kind of kept being piqued. My interest was still peaked, and I just kept talking to people in this particular community, and yeah, just kept trying out new things and purchasing new items and trying them out and seeing how it went. And it was just only a little bit later that people said, hey, you seem to be doing like a pretty cool job of like documenting what you do, and so that kind of led me to what I'm doing now.
Mm.
And so
And
it's been interesting.
yeah, I think I think the part of it for me that kind of like also helped draw me in, and maybe you can shed some light on this, because for me it was always kind of like a big part of the lore of this hobby were these like very high end. Um, I don't even know if they were manufacturers, because they just seemed to be people that designed these things and then had them manufactured, and then you'd get in these group buys, but maybe there's only a few of them available, and they were kind of like legendary, and they would sell for exorbitant sums in the aftermarket. Like I remember the first time that I heard about Duck, and what that was, and what was different about it from like Ducky, and then some of the layouts that were in some of those boards, and then TGR came along. Like that kind of built up this like mythical lore around these things to me that I was just like I couldn't get enough of it. I don't know if those builders or designers are still like on the scene as prevalent as they were, where they're only making 10 or 20 of them or something like that. But that's kind of what like piqued my curiosity of just what you could do with these things, like all the way up to the high end type levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is definitely a mystique around the different makers and the designers in this particular community. I think it especially just comes about because these people are individuals and it's just a one person does something small initially for themselves. They say, hey, I have a need for a particular layout, a particular type of keyboard, and they make it. And at the end of the day, these people also don't have necessarily the means to be producing a large scale kind of production.
Hmm.
And so these items are made in small batches. That's what we call group buys. It's we basically collect funds from a group of people who are interested in that specific thing. And then it's sent off, yeah, as you said, to a factory manufacturer to be produced.
Hmm.
And once that happens, it's gone. You know, it's a one and done kind of thing, unless that particular person decides to run it again, which is obviously rare because they just did it for themselves initially.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's definitely a lot of mystique around that, especially like you kind of feel like you missed the boat, you missed out on it. And then you hear about it later, people kind of laud it. You know, people talk about how good it is, how interesting it is, how different it is, or groundbreaking it is. And I think as a spectator or as a newcomer, you might feel, wow, I really missed out on that. I really be part of that. And so you start partaking in these particular group buys and these particular small projects, small ideas that come about. And I think that's how people just kind of stay in this particular niche, is that there's always something, some small project that grows into something a little bit bigger, a little bit more interesting as time goes on. And there's sometimes user feedback associated with it that's implemented into it. And so that kind of improves that small idea into something even bigger. And I think that's kind of what made this space grow over time. There was the interest of these small kind of niche ideas growing into something that's more usable for everybody and that everybody gets to appreciate a little bit more as they are further and further into this particular niche.
Yeah, yeah. I think the FOMO is certainly real with a lot of these things, and of course, I think a lot of people would come into it and then discover that the group buy ended like a year ago, and people, were still talking about it and waiting for the keyboards, which might not arrive for another like year or something. And then seeing one come up in the market was always like this really exciting thing, and that's how I ended up discovering a lot of these boards. And I think what made them interesting to me was the kind of interesting layouts that they employed. Something like the Duck TCV3, for instance,
Yeah.
or even like the Duck Viper, which was kind of like my was one of the boards that really pulled me in just because of that HHKB layout that it used. And then he had one that was like an 1800 with no gaps. It was just like a sea of keycaps, but seeing all of these layouts was like really what opened up my eyes to, oh, this is something that like I could really make to my own means, I guess. So, like however I would want to use it, and then program it however I would want to use it. And to this day, one of my daily boards is a TC V3 a Duck, which has held up really well. But you mentioned these are designers, and then maybe some of them like new manufacturers that were really high quality. And I remember there was being rumors about like, oh, this guy uses the same people that Apple used for some part of the iPhone or something like that. So it kind of build the legend of
Yeah.
these boards, right? And then I feel like the one that came along that kind of like went mainstream in a different kind of way was the TGR Jane and like the V2 of that, because it kind of came when
Yeah.
things were at like a
Hmm.
fever pitch in the hobby, and of course not many of those were made.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like the biggest fervor around a board that I remember in some time, like maybe that in the 910. But that Jane board, is still stands out in my mind as kind of like a legendary board.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think a lot of the fever associated with it also was that because they're limited quantity and as the population of this particular hobby grows, there's just not enough for everybody, and people kind of are not necessarily fighting against, but kind of competing slightly against, especially for this particular TGR Jane. Um, what happened was that they would do like first come, first serve for the signups for the production slots of the board, and so you just had to be there at the right time and the right place. And so if you do miss out, it's a bummer. And it's true. I think it's mostly because we, at least in kind of like common goods out there, or just in general any kind of product that you buy off a store or whatever, you don't quite associate the amount of time that you have to wait for that, I think. And so because it's usually just ready made and it's already in stock, and you just buy it off the store and you just get it in the mail, right? But in this particular niche, because we are essentially in there from the very first step, which is to submit this particular order to the factory, and then it essentially gets made, it's not a guarantee that it's going to be made until everybody kind of pulls all that money and all that time together. And then you have to wait until it's all made. And so, because the production does start from scratch, it can take anywhere from, as little as a few months, up till, yeah, even a couple of years. In the case of the pandemic, when it hit, it just really halted all kinds of manufacturing and production capabilities. And so people were waiting here for 2, even close to 3 years.
Mm. Mm.
So, it was a tough time, I think, around then, especially definitely around 2019 and coming up into a pandemic. That was definitely a time when things kind of really exploded in this particular hobby.
Yeah, and then I feel like a lot of it opened the door for a lot of resellers and speculators like to enter the space as well, which of course was kind of like
For sure.
reaching its heights around the pandemic as well, uh, which complicated things even further, where people would come in and get these things and then start selling them for two, three, four, $5,000 on the secondary market, and people were buying them, and which kind of was, I
Yeah.
feel like, a bummer for the broader community who had been there a long time, who understood these things, maybe a little bit better in what they were getting, were kind of like priced out of their own hobby, which is definitely like a huge parallel to
Oh,
to the watch
certainly.
space as well. So
Yeah.
and then the keycaps
Yeah.
is
No.
like a whole other element to it as well, and that kind of started kind of getting into the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think the keycaps too. I think nowadays there's a lot of new resources from in-stock supplies and products, and new vendors have come in and gone out in the pandemic period as well as before. And then keycaps is an interesting thing. It sort of starts as this thing that initially is just made for like point of service products, right? Like pre-builts and whatnot. And then now we have all these keycap options that vary in, first of all, materials. Like there's ABS plastic and PBT plastics. There's of course different manufacturers. It first started with like old big companies like Cherry Corporation,
Hmm.
and then now we have people who have sort of like inherited a lot of that knowledge and applied their engineering expertise to making these new keycaps. And now there's new options to make, um, you know, double shot injection molded plastic keycaps of various colors with various materials. And now you have different vendors pretty much working with a variety of manufacturers to produce them in all forms, and profiles and whatever. That means profiles meaning the shape of the particular keycap,
Hmm.
and how it feels when you're typing on it. And yeah, and effectively it grew from something that was, hey, well, let's submit just a small batch order of 100 or 200 sets for people, to, I think, in the pandemic, at the peak of it, we had orders of 5, 6,000, 7,000.
Hmm.
And so we were talking about really big production. And these some of these companies are actually making, from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars.
Hmm.
And so it's become a rather big business in just the customization aspect, and in one particular part of it alone, which is keycaps. And keyboards, of course, they have their own issues and their own particular little caveats and little subtleties associated with the whole manufacturing process as well. And that's grown a lot in the past few years.
And I feel like there's something to be considered here between these two elements, because some of the keyboards that we've been talking about have, as I mentioned, I guess, unconventional layouts, you could say. The
Yeah.
TCV3, for instance, has a kind of a grouping of keys off to the left, that you wouldn't find on like a normal keyboard, and this comes into play when you are selecting the keycaps that you're going to put on your keyboard, because they all have to
Yeah.
kind of fit the profile that you need them to, across those rows. So unless you're going with something like a DSA profile, which is flat, and uniform across the entire board, you have to consider, is this going to provide coverage for my board? And not only that, and there's something else that we'll get into, the layout that you prefer using. And I don't know about you, but like my preference for like the layout that I use has changed, and I have kind of like I don't know if it's super unique, but I like the backspace down on the row two, so it's like just right above the
Mhm.
return. I find that easier. So it's little things like that, and then a function with a short shift over on the right. So like those are little kind of things that I make sure to look for in the keycap sets that are being produced, and a lot of them offer different like small kits that are produced in various numbers, as I understand it, just because it's a smaller market of people that use some of these more like, I guess, niche layouts, would be the way to put it.
Yeah.
So, um, which I think is an interesting thing, here in terms of the manufacturers that you've mentioned, like Signature Plastics and GMK. I feel like are the two still major ones, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I would say they're pretty big. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are the ones making the same profiles, like that cherry profile that you mentioned, is made
Mhm.
and owned, I believe, by GMK. Like that's the only place you can get them.
Yeah, I believe they own the molds from the original company, it's Cherry, and that produced it.
Okay, okay.
They basically kind of bought out the technology that was being used to make those ABS double shot plastic keycaps from Cherry, and so GMK is the lead kind of vendor out there for that. They're based in Germany, and then there's a lot of other people, like in China. There's a lot of um, designers and manufacturers like Hammerwork, CRP. There's Enjoy PBT. There's a few
Mm,
others out there that also produce cherry profile, but for example, they produce it in PVT plastic, which is a different kind of plastic.
hmm
And then yeah, Signature Plastics, which you mentioned, they're American based. They make these uniform profiles like the DSA profile, but they also make these spherical kind of retro looking profiles like the SA profile,
hmm
which is a very tall kind of profile. And so we
Yeah.
have just a variety, and there's been more popping up lately. And so it's been pretty cool to see just the amount of variety that exists now. Compared to the beginning, I think you usually consider maybe three or four profiles, but now you have over a handful of them,
Yeah, it's great to hear there's
even
more
more,
options
maybe like
for
10 or
people.
so.
And I
Yeah.
mentioned kind of legendary keyboards that have all this lore around them. It's the same with keycap sets too. Before this was kind of as big as it was. In the SA that you mentioned, that's the kind of tall, like those are the real retro looking um, caps, like like SA, like Penumbra and Calm Depths, and just like
Oh wow.
colorways that were, like, oh, that person has a set, or one came up for sale and it's like, it's gone in an instant, kind of a thing. I remember, just sets like this, really kind of trying to keep an eye out for. I guess now they've done all kinds of like reruns of these classic colorways, if I'm remembering
Yes,
correctly.
true.
uh which
Yeah, yeah, there have been
have
reruns.
there. And let's see, like the Hyperfuse was another one, and I feel like the guy that designed some of those early ones was, I don't know if he's still around the community or not, um, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff that made this like really fun for me back in the day and kind of pulled me through. Of course now I have these like totes full of keycap sets, so maybe once a quarter or something like that I'll swap around, swap them out to get a different feel. What's your preferred profile of cap to use?
For keycap sets, I prefer the cherry profile. I think just generally, I've tried just the whole variety out there and have settled to that cylindrical shape that the cherry profile
Hmm
has. It's similar to what's out there on a lot of the pre-builds nowadays. But it's just comfortable. It's just comfortable. The profiles are very nice to use. It's kind of aesthetically pleasing when you look at it from the side, when you're looking at your desk from afar, even up close. And so yeah, I think pretty much I stick to what a lot of us like more, I guess, veteran enthusiasts kind of stick to, which is a lot of the GMK, a lot of the like the PBT, like Hammerworks or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've kind of stuck to that. As far as like layouts, I think you were mentioning earlier, I actually do have a TCV3
Oh, do
myself.
you?
Very interesting layout. Yeah, yeah, I do. I actually also was a. I think back when we started, it was definitely a big thing to follow. Duck,
Hmm
Duck he's an old engineer from Korea, right? He makes all these keyboards in different layouts, and he was really the trailblazer for a lot of that stuff, as well as there's of course like older designers or design groups out there like OTD and those guys,
Yeah.
right? Who are also Korean based. And then there's been some more based elsewhere, like in Southeast Asia as well as like in Europe and here in America as well. But layout wise, I pretty much stick to two different layouts. For me, the 60%, right? Just like the Duck Viper that you
Mm,
mentioned, is for me the ideal space saving and yet still functional layout. And then I do TKLs a lot, 10 kilos, which is kind of like the standard, um, the cut down version from the full size, just without the numpad.
mm,
Pretty much it has everything I need. And since at least in custom mechanical keyboards, you can reprogram things, you can get access to more things for any kind of keys that you might need. And then I would say it's probably the aesthetically most pleasing for me,
mm.
especially just trying out different keycap sets as well as just different kind of colors of boards and things like that. I think it's just been those two layouts that have been for me the most pleasing to use.
And do you use? Tell me about your bottom row. Here, are you a 7 unit spacebar guy with the real wide, command keys out there on the edges?
Yeah, I do like 7U for most of my keyboard builds. And for example, I adopt a lot of what the Happy Hacking keyboard, the HKV uses, right? Like the control, I map that onto where the caps lock position is. On 60%, occasionally I will also do what you said when the backspace is right above the return or the enter
Mm-hmm.
key. The split backspace, I'll occasionally do that like on 60% especially, but for larger layouts, I kind of stick to more of the classic layout. But I do have my preferences. I use like step caps lock for
Mm,
for the aesthetics of
yeah.
it. But I still map the control on that part. And for the bottom row, yeah, I pretty much go with, if it's like a 10 keyless board, right? I always try to pick out the win keyless blocker board, which yeah, it doesn't have a win key, but I can remap things. So I actually map the win key where the left control originally
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
and the left control goes where the caps lock is. And so, you can kind of play around with that layout. And so that's how I've adapted my own typing to my particular needs, and still being able to satisfy what I want aesthetics wise.
Yeah, it's so cool, and in all these kind of weird layouts that we're talking about, I don't mean weird in a bad way, because they're not weird, and in fact, like they're not even that new, and I feel like a lot of the, there are parts of the community um, that has gone to great lengths to kind of like look into the history of these things, not only like the keycaps themselves, but different kind of unusual layouts that were used in. Like corporate settings, like the kiosk
Hmm.
behind at the airport when they would take your ticket or something like that. And some of the boards and layouts that have come to light, I think, are really fascinating. And I think obviously it's all kind of centered in this like ergonomic discussion around like what the individual jobs, like um, needs were, right? And are a lot of these kind of
Hmm.
born from things like that?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, I think a lot of the layouts that we have are, I would say the vast majority of them are, I mean, at least for the 10 keyless, for example, it's born out of the classic IBM keyboard, right? And the airport keyboard that you're talking about is probably the 1800 layout, which is used a lot of in the like server racks, where they still use a lot of do a lot of data entry and number entry. So they do have a numpad, but it's a slightly more compact layout because the server rack doesn't have that much room to store a keyboard.
Mm,
And so a lot of these layouts are born out of need. 60% were born out of the need of having more space on the desk for the gamers and the users out there who might need more space, and they just don't have the depth of the desk to use that, to use a larger keyboard. And so it's interesting. We kind of think of this as like a novel idea, as like an innovative idea, but then it is born. It has a precedent to it. I think a lot of the things that we have in our community have some kind of historical precedent. And I think now we justify it because now we can think about the comfort of that, the aesthetics of that, the customizability of that. And of course, if you are really deep into the hobby, you're thinking about how it's going to type, how it's going to feel, and how it's going to sound. Um, and just these are some of the considerations that I think a lot of the enthusiasts in this particular niche have, and that people coming from outside might just be getting introduced to it and then realize how that actually does improve what they perceive to be such a mundane kind of daily device.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that I want to talk about a little bit as well. The kind of why of all this, and of course, is beyond, um, just our enjoyment of customizing things and the aesthetic element of it, which we'll get into. I just want to make a quick note about a book that is, I think, maybe it's still in pre-order. It's called Shift Happens, on Kickstarter by Marcin. Wikari, I think, and this is a
Mhm.
documentation of the history of keyboards from early typewriters to modern mechanical marvels, told in 2 volumes. So I'll leave a link to that down in the show notes below if you're curious about that. I think he's about to ship these books. So um, at any rate, the why of this kind of stuff. I mentioned earlier that it can be a little therapeutic to go through some of this stuff, like the soldering. Of all of the switches into a PCB. But there's more than that, isn't there? And there's a lot of like little things that I think maybe people might not realize, and a lot of little, at least back when I was doing this, like kind of, I don't know, maybe not like cheats, but like the Band-Aid mod to get a little padding underneath the stabilizers, and things that would kind of like reduce the kind of clackiness of, especially the space bar, which I always had a hard time getting like tuned just right. But there are people that open up the switches themselves and tune the switches for their own need. And this really comes down to like the weight of the spring inside of the switch, and then you applying certain or different types of lubrication, as far as I know, to different areas of the switch, all in trying to get this kind of a feel that you like. And of course, there's switches with bumps and switches with no bumps and switches with clicks. Um, yeah, I think there's a preconceived notion that all these that mechanical keyboards are all like super loud and clicky, but it's not like that. And there are
Yeah.
different switch options that are silent. I always preferred these switches from Zelio, these silent Zelio switches with like a 52-gram spring in them, and then lubed on a certain part of the switch. Then it would really all kind of come to life. And once you get it all together, after like a full afternoon or day, and then sitting down and typing like a few paragraphs on it is what like really when it all started to click. Uh, is this something that you do? Is this something that people still do and discuss, like different spring types, different switch types, different lubrication types? Is this something that people are still like getting deep down into the science of?
Oh, absolutely. I think I mean I have like a small server, like a Discord server where people also talk like community related stuff as well as just kind of like their own preferences. I think a lot of the time the daily interaction on small community places like that is that or like message boards, right? Like keycap and other places and Reddit
Mm-hmm.
is that you everyone has their own preferences, then that's kind of like what's being preached out there. It's like everyone has their own preference, everyone has their particular liking of the spring weighting, right? Like some people are typists, some people are lighter typists, some people actually just have the need for a lighter typing experience because they just maybe have trouble typing.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's difficult for them, or maybe they're suffering from a particular health concern that they might have, and that just requires them a certain ergonomic way of doing things. And yeah, I think people just kind of get into the little niche, like small details about how to lubricate the switch. Some people say, okay, well, I want something that feels a little bit more buttery, right? So they apply a bit more lubricant. Some people will say, I want something that still feels like the stock switch, like the one I get from the shop, but I still want to get rid of some of that extra crunchy sound that comes out of the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll talk about, which particular oil they're using or which particular lubricant they're using. And same thing, like with the silencing and whatnot. I think if you go into a different type of mechanical switch, in this case, the Topper switch, right?
Mm-hmm.
People will talking about how to use silencing pads or silencing rings to kind of dampen some of the extra like high frequency noise or extraneous noise that happens in the case or in the particular switch. And so yeah, I think these discussions just happen on the daily. Not just in my particular community, but it just happens everywhere. And this is actually a discussion I do have pretty often. And at the end of the day, it's just the minutiae, and it's also part of the fun. I think it's the fact that we all have preferences, and that, for example, in my case, as a mechanical keyboard builder, right, I provide a build service for people out there. People do approach me with those particular needs in mind and say, "Hey, so I'm actually looking for this, and I actually don't really know the terminology or what products to buy,
Mm-hmm.
but I know you've been exposed to all of these. So, what options do you think would be good?" right? And I kind of recommend them a few different ideas, and we just go in this back and forth what is going to kind of nail down that particular taste, that particular typing feel that they might want or sound that they might want. And yeah, it's just this constant pursuit. I think those tastes also change over time. I know folks who have been in this particular scene just about as long as ourselves, and they're still tuning small things. Like they're still saying, "Hey, I realized that I actually like this particular spring weighting more, and I'm going back on my keyboards, like on all the ones that I've built so far, and just swapping them all. And I'm like, how long that's going to take, because if you did solder them, you have to
Yeah.
desolder them, and then you have to take them all out, and you have to open them all up, and just be careful that all the pieces are all there, and replacing them. And it's a very tedious but at the same time rewarding
Hmm.
process, I think.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I think it's just once you start using it, right? Once you start typing away, once you start using it on your daily life, it's when it really pays off, and you realize, oh, that was actually pretty much worth it. And I did it myself, so I'm kind of proud of it, right? I think
Yeah.
that's the big appeal of this particular hobby.
Yeah, it's very satisfying when it all comes together in a way that you like. And honestly, like I feel like sometimes it just takes. I mean, again, these are things that we are using constantly all throughout the day. Writing 10,000 words on or whatever. So I think it's something that like after a few weeks of use really kind of starts to like make a lot of sense to like as you're using it. So if people are listening to this and thinking that we probably sound a little crazy. Like what, like how would like somebody new coming into the space, like even discern, like start to like, okay, what are the different like kind of switch types? What makes them different? And why would I want to go through all this with, with the switches? Is there a good like source that's like a, um, like a primer on this kind of stuff that for newcomers to this space that they could look into or start, I guess studying if they're curious?
Yeah, I do think there are now guides out there. I mean, I personally tend to kind of teach people through my live streams in particular. When people just come in and ask questions live, and I just kind of answer them, and I'm also open to receiving messages from folks. But there are also guides, written guides out there. I believe Mr. Alex Botos, he's based in Toronto. He's written up a nice guide. I believe Mr. Matt Encina, who is kind of into also like lifestyle kind of content.
Hmm.
I think his website's Mod Musings. He also has like a small guide on how to build mechanical keyboards, how to choose parts. Of course, you can always look up on YouTube on how to XYZ on mechanical keyboards, and there's a bunch of guides out there for it too. There are, I think, the keyboard hobby right now in particular is the most accessible it has ever
Hmm.
been. There are not only now there's kits that you can assemble without any kind of soldering experience required, and the parts are as cheap and as accessible as they can be. They're all in stock and available at different vendors in many, many different regions, not just North America. Um, and yeah, so it's just the amount of options out there, and I think now with all these guides and all these resources, it's as easy as ever to get into this particular thing. I think when we came in, there wasn't as much as that. You did kind of have to go through the word of mouth a little bit so that you can learn a few tips and tricks and here and there from more veteran experienced members at the same time as reading some of the small amount of information that's out there actually written out and documented.
Hmm.
But now I think that's a completely different story.
Yeah.
It's definitely very, very accessible now.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think that's a really good thing, and something that the space needed was more accessibility. And I'll say, when I started to really get curious into this, I would just dive into the old threads on Geekhack and just like read through them entirely, which was helpful for me. But there's, if as you might have surmised by listening to us, there's endless combinations here that you could arrive at, that you can choose from to kind of suit your taste. So and as you mentioned, you don't have to do the soldering thing. I feel like it was maybe this Australian guy Rama that came along that was the first that I remember kind of like being exposed to a PCB that you could just press the switch into. Uh, so there's
Mhm.
a layer between those two things. So of course you put the switch into the plate, whether it's plastic or composite or steel or aluminum or something, and then the switch would just go right into the circuit board. Is this becoming like a bigger thing?
Yeah, so that's what we nowadays we call hot swap socket PCBs, right? So PCB just stands for printed circuit board, and hot swap socket is exactly what it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like. It pretty much allows you to pop in or pop out switches as you wish, whether that might be an individual switch or the whole entire keyboard. And so they're basically little plastic sockets with metallic inserts that essentially create that circuit, that full circuit with the circuit board that's like the brains of the keyboard that's doing all the work of digitizing your keystrokes and sending them to computer, right? And nowadays, instead of creating that direct bond of the metal pin from the switch to the actual circuit board using solder, nowadays we have these hot swap sockets that allow you to just insert or remove the switches as you need.
Mm-hmm.
There's pros and cons to all these different methods, but the good thing is that you can choose, and they're all accessible. And oftentimes they'll offer both options out there. So if you're here as a new purchaser of a particular product, that you usually will be given the option to pick between two. So if you're new and trying things out, then hot swap is a highly recommended thing, because you get to try out different switches as well on the same particular keyboard that you bought, instead of having to commit to one thing and redoing it all over if you had to. And not to mention, the price is no different. It's usually $5 to $10 difference, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, in between choosing the solderable option and the hot swap option. But some I think the more veteran enthusiasts do prefer soldering before, because they can commit to it, and it affords some kind of flexibility in the layouts they're picking. And the parts are just kind of stuck on there, so there's no kind of vibrations or movements that you have to worry about, or the switch popping off by accident because you popped off a keycap or something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, I think the good thing is that the option is now available, and it's pretty much widespread now.
So.
It definitely started a few years ago, as you said, with like RamaWorks and a few smaller vendors out
Mhm.
there, but now it's pretty much ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
So and that brings up kind of like something that I think about sometimes with some of these, I guess, not old, but maybe like more classic, like unusual layouts for boards that, I don't know if I could go and get like a different PCB to put in there. Um,
Yeah.
like the TCV3 free, for instance, or the Duck Jetfire, I
Yeah.
think it was, or something like that. That had kind of like these really unique layouts that I couldn't just go and get a third party circuit board that was like hot swappable or
Mhm.
anything like that. Does that kind of thing exist? So I guess that's something that maybe people should keep in mind if they want to opt for an unconventional layout, right?
Yeah, it's certainly true that the more unconventional the item that you're trying to buy is the likelihood that the parts are going to be exclusive to itself. Like the layout being one thing, and the particular like plate or PCB in this case that you're talking about. So if you do need like replacement materials for those, at least for a lot of designers and a lot of makers out there, for the plate, for example, they will release plate files. They'll just release like 2D plate files that you can just send out to a
Mm,
like a laser cutting service or CNC machining service. Then they can produce a one off, or maybe you're doing a small group thing and getting 10 of them, right?
hmm
But you can definitely make those different plates in different materials if you wanted to try different materials as well. And as far as circuit boards are concerned, I think the main tip I would say is, if you're buying something very niche and you know that maybe it can break or something like that, just get an extra.
mm,
But if it's something that maybe you're willing to go through the effort of asking some of the experts out there, maybe some PCB designer or someone like that, then you can always commission someone to kind of do this kind of bespoke one-off item for you that just replicates that particular circuit board that maybe broke, or maybe you just want a replacement of. There's people who do that. I wouldn't say like the service is like kind of like actively available out there and people like promote it all the time, but there definitely are folks out there who are very very talented, very skilled, and smart engineers who can actually reverse engineer the particular circuit board that you might have and make a replacement for
Oh,
that.
that's amazing. Yeah, from what I remember, this seemed to be kind of like a pretty tight knit community that was always willing to help each other out. I actually remember sending boards. I think it was a duck jet fired over to this guy in Seattle, so he could use it to get to the PCB onto VIA. Um, or at least like program a profile for it or something like that. And he needed the actual PCB, so I sent it to him,
Oh,
which he was
yeah.
able to do. The magician or something like that. I forget what his username was, but
McMerlin,
yeah,
probably.
Merlin. Yes, yeah, yep.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and that's the other part of this is I hope that the kind of customization in terms of the programming element has become a lot easier or at least more idiot proof like me if you're not really someone that's exposed to a lot of like coding, I guess.
Yeah, I think a lot of technicality of that is completely gone now. It's been made common for very easy to follow user interface where it's just kind of plug and play and you just click and choose
Mm.
if you want to remap a key and whatnot. And a lot of the circuit boards nowadays will just come pre-flash, meaning that they're already pre-programmed for that user interface to be used, which actually is like web accessible, so you don't even have to have a program installed on your computer
Oh wow.
nowadays, which is pretty cool.
Okay.
The hobby has really come such a long way in terms of accessibility. I think just kind of like anywhere from the what people call the low end or the mid, right? It's really grown so much where there's been a pretty strong race to the bottom. So sort of trying to get a very, very accessible product at a very cheap
Hmm.
price. Not to mention the quality standard has gone up quite a bit, and you can get a really, really nice keyboard or whatever accessory you might need for very cheap nowadays. And of course, the high end or the more exclusive end, if you're looking for that like one limited thing, does exist as well. So people, there's kind of like a little bit of everything for everyone.
Yeah.
But I would say in terms of convenience and quality of life experience, especially I think you would know as a person who used like the duck keyboards, right? The duck keyboard programmability was kind of a
Oh my
nightmare
god.
because
Yeah.
back in the day they also had like the Korean um program, right? Like it was done in Korean,
Mm.
and so like you had like there was this whole complexity with being Windows only and whatnot. And so but that's virtually gone now, and it's amazing. I mean, there certainly are some people who do still do proprietary software and whatnot, but it's very rare. I think now the demand for having a working product that's accessible, that's um, OS agnostic, so like you can use it on any operating system on any computer, has is pretty much a necessity now for a product to be successful. And so I think that's just easy to get, and it's pretty much going to be there as soon as you get the particular product.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. It sounds like a great time to be entering the space if you're out there listening and have any curiosity in this kind of thing. I've got two unbuilt boards right now that are kind of older ones, I guess. TX, I have a TX CP and a TX 1800, yeah, which ended up being like two of my favorite boards from kind of back in the day, that I had sold. Um, and I put out a wanted to buy thread, and a few people came out of the woodwork and had some that were unbuilt. So I'm waiting to build those until I kind of get my head around the modern landscape of like switches and if there's anything new that I would want to try over my standby Zelio switches. All right, so as we wrap things down, do you have a preferred? I know you mentioned that you like the profile GMK or the cherry profile. Do you have a colorway? Do you swap your caps very often, or do you have like a single colorway that you stick with?
Yeah, no, I do have a very large number of keycap sets. I mean, not just because of the type of work that I do, but just because I'm a collector as well. I do have a number of keycap sets that I personally like. I mean, I have also run a couple of sets myself, like through the
Mm,
community. But I would say some of the classics. I mean, I think the undeniable classics, or what people call the holy trinity, so out there, is going to be white on black,
hmm.
any kind of beige colorway sets, which is very like retro vintage
Yeah.
looking, and then there is the dolce
Oh
colorway,
yeah.
right, which is
Hmm.
a dark gray and a warm gray combination, which you can mix and match with accents and whatnot. That's a very versatile
Yeah.
set. I think those three sets are kind of like I think most enthusiasts will come about and either dislike them at first for looking very boring and bland, or they might kind of embrace it because it is boring and bland. It has the versatility of being neutral. So I think those are three are kind of like must-haves. But some others that I personally really enjoy are there's GMK Honeywell,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is somewhat vintage based, but it has this white, gray, and red sort of based color palette. Um, and I think oh yeah, like Jim Kitaro, for example, might be another one that's more recent, but it's also this like very heavy and saturated purples with like yellow and teal accents that come about.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think there's many key sets that I do like, and I do swap them pretty frequently. I sometimes, heck, I mean, I think I'm definitely on the very, very deep end of collectors who I will purchase keyboards solely because they offer a particular color that will match a particular set. And so
Sure.
I think that's kind of what happens once you get deep enough. It's you're picking because you want to mix and match very, very specific things,
Yeah.
and you're pretty much waiting for that criteria to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
so
love it.
yeah, I've kind of done a little bit of everything there.
Those are all
Yeah.
just awesome keycap sets that you mentioned. I use Honeywell often. I think I have GMK Metropolis on the TCV3 right now. But
Mhm.
Honeywell is just kind of one that I always come back to. And then, as you mentioned, the kind of beige ones, the GMK 9009. I think is still just like an all-time
Mhm.
great. I remember the first time I put that keycap set on a keyboard in my office, and somebody saw it and said, "What is that? The first keyboard ever made?" And they all started kind of like laughing at me. And then they came over and like picked it up, and it was like super heavy. And they were like, "What is this thing?" And then of course, like they all had questions about it, and it's one of those just weird things that you see, and it's just like so captivating. But I think I was able to win a few people over into this space with that. Uh,
That's good. Yeah, I've done the same at work.
yeah, it's a fun experience for people to learn and see this stuff for the first time. And then like I tell them, well, type on it for a while, and they're like, oh, that's really interesting, because it's not something that you ever you take it for granted completely.
Yeah.
Typing on like crappy keyboards all day every day, and you type on something
Hmm.
that's like a different experience. It's like really
Yeah.
refined, and it's like whoa, it's like enlightening. Pretty cool.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's yeah. It's the daily life items, right? You don't think about them until you experience something different.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So is there any are there any like group buys or new up and coming brands or designers or anybody that like in particular that's kind of caught your eye right now that other people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many nowadays. I think some of the particular projects that I've been enjoying. There's a designer from Texas. His name is Juan, but he goes by Dodgy Keyboards, Daji Keyboards. He does kind of like classic inspired keyboard designs, and yet he still implements some like more modern items. Like for example, like there's a new board that, oh no, not new, but there's one that's about to fulfill called the Stay Set, which is like a 60%, as it implies.
Mm.
And that, for example, has Bluetooth. So you can actually use it wireless if you want it.
Oh, nice.
And yeah. So there's things like that, and of course there are kind of like big vendors who, or rather, big designers who have done a lot of new projects. Of course, like Singa KBD, Singa keyboards. They're pretty popular. They're sort of like the sort of like the cousin of TGR, right? I mean, not quite literally, more so they're like close friends,
Oh,
but
sure.
they have the similar kind of like high end reputation, right?
Yeah.
They've also been putting new stuff out there, and then yeah, there's just a plethora of them out there.
Mm.
For example, like soon I'm going to be reviewing this particular product. I think it's called a Neo 80, and it's a TKL for like sub $150, but it's perfectly, it has everything. It's like nice anodization for the case, right? And it comes with pretty much all the accessories you need, and it looks very nice. And they're selling it for under $200, which at least in this particular side of the community, it's considered pretty inexpensive.
Mm.
Although I understand that anyone coming new to this particular niche might be thinking, "Wow, I'm spending over $20 to $50 for a keyboard. That's insane."
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the deep end really has no end. But
Yeah.
I think there's just the plethora of new products that are available have gotten a lot more accessible and cheaper, and still preserve a lot of the quality and a lot of the features that people are asking for.
Mm.
So
Well, it's great to hear. And this was one question that I have to ask. Somebody sent me a message asking that I ask you your favorite resin cast
Sure.
click clack. Favorite resin cast click clack from Jeff Leopard
Of
on
course.
Instagram. And this kind of
Okay.
opens up
Okay.
something that we didn't even get into, which is a whole other discussion, which is like these custom keycaps.
Dear.
So, or artisans, I guess I should
Yeah.
say, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's a niche I'm pretty deep into myself.
Okay.
I do know Mr. Jeff Leopard. um, it's a tough question, but I would say um one of my favorite. I mean, I don't. It's not a cap that I own, but one of my favorite resin caps, clay clags. Clay clag is the name of a particular maker. Actually, the first known artisan maker recorded in like the geek hack side of the history.
Mm.
Is this one? They make this very infamous, very famous skull design keycap, and I think one of the colorways I really like from that is the tri shark colorways, like this sort of this blue grayish color, and with a gray base and with some lilac accents on it,
Uh,
and it looks great. But anyway, it's just this classic. But yeah, in artisan keycaps, that's a whole niche. That's a
yeah.
niche within a niche, and I would say that's where also a lot of the just very very deep end community members are born into. And so basically it's, I mean, to just put it shortly, right, it's going to be there's artists who sculpt a particular small miniature sculpture out of clay. They'll mold it with silicone, and then they will cast them they'll cast them by hand with resin, like whether it's polyurethane or epoxy resin, and they'll make them in different colors, and those will be produced, and they're basically miniature artwork for which have keycap features, so you can still mount them on your keyboard, and people will purchase them for whatever amount. I mean, they sell them. They typically have raffles for them
Mhm.
because they make a limited number of them, and they'll do a variety of different colorways for a particular design, maybe retire one design and sculpt a different one, and so on. And there's nowadays, I would say, there's hundreds of makers out there, but when I was starting, there were maybe like a few dozen that were very well known.
Yeah.
And it's also a scene that has grown immensely to the point where you could say that nowadays there's a decent amount of saturation on all aspects of the keyboard hobby,
Mm.
both keyboards, keycaps, as well as these resin cast artisan keycaps as well.
Yeah.
But that side is just really if you want to go deeper to the customizing end or into the appreciating more of the creative side, more of the artistic side of the community. I think that's also another part that can be considered very, very niche, and not to mention completely extravagant as far as it's not something that you need. It's something
Yeah.
that you appreciate because you like the creative efforts of people out there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's something that watch people I think can certainly appreciate. So I have one. It's a
Oh,
fugu. It's a
absolutely.
fugu. I think I have in the GMK
Yeah.
Hyperfuse colorway that came with,
Mm.
or I wanted it with one of the first early runs of GMK Hyperfuse. So I never know what to do with it,
Oh, the
but it looks
keycap
very
set.
cool.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it certainly. I remember even back when people would post pictures of these arts and keycaps, they're like, "Wow, it really ruins the aesthetic of the board
yeah, yeah,
because it looks very spiky or it looks very off." It's like, wow, I don't want this fish-looking keycap on my keyboard. I
yeah.
just want my flat profile keycaps. But
Exactly.
I think there's a little bit of everything for everyone.
Yeah,
Different different strokes. So
yeah. Absolutely.
that's definitely a very very niche
Yeah.
aspect.
Well, yeah, there'll be. I'll leave links to some of the stuff down below in the show notes. So keep an eye out for that. Uh, Diego, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. It's just been awesome to talk to you. Where can people go find more of you? Where can they go follow you and watch you build keyboards?
Sure. So I feature new projects and designs through live streams. I do custom keyboard builds. I typically do it on Twitch, so you can find me on twitch.tv/lightning keyboards altogether. Or I also do have a website, lightningkeyboards.com, and you can go to all my other socials there. There's Instagram, Discord, Twitter, whatever that might be. I've also been at different live events. Like I think this past year I was at PAX East, as well as a special feature with Honda. But I try to participate as much as I can in the community, whether it might be in real life meetups as well as local events here in the New York City area. And so yeah, you can find me there, and most of the time you'll definitely find me online.
All right. Well, there you have it, Diego. Thank you again. It's just been a huge pleasure talking to you today on the Deep Track podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Blake.
All right. And that is our episode for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can go subscribe to this podcast from wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any issues, feel free to email us at info@thedeeptrack.com. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, take care.